All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD, or Application and Website Development 1100 C# programming class, online class for the summer 2023 semester, I've been doing a series of introductory type of video presentations based on the textbook for the class, that being Murachs C# 8th edition. I'm up to chapter 19 of 22. In this last section, in chapters 19, 20, 21, and 22, we will be introduced to database programming. Now, this chapter, even though it's entitled An Introduction to Database Programming, it's more an introduction to databases. And I'm going to do this a little differently from what's in the book. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my control panel. All right, and I'm going to remove a program I've got there, Programs and Features, and I'm going to find one that's called XAMPP, X-A-M-P-P. Some call it XAMPP and some call it XAMPP. All right, the version I have is about 6 months old, so I'm just going to uninstall it and then reinstall it so you can see what I'm going to do here. It'll run through the uninstall process, which could take anywhere from a half a minute to a couple minutes. And again, if you have it on your machine, you probably don't. It'll just depend on the speed, your internet connection, etc. I'm going to end up uninstalling this when we go through the chapter in class as well. Don't know why it's waiting here, but it must be grabbing some system information or something. Because usually the actual uninstall process is very short. Now I told it it's going to save everything in a special folder called htdocs. And I had some stuff in there already, and I told it not to remove that. That might be why this is taking a little bit longer. I don't know. So we are going to use XAMPP, and it's right there. It kind of looks like a little dog bone or something like that. So I'm going to unpin this, and we'll put it back out there again in a couple of minutes. It is not a small package in that it looks on here that the size at the time when I loaded it last was about 750 meg. But really, like I said, the way to, when you load this, etc., it really doesn't take long. Now I'm afraid to stop this because I don't know what it's doing. All right, so it says it's uninstalling, but it should go a heck of a lot faster than this. Tell you what, while that's working, let's start on the chapter itself. So before you can develop a database app, you need to be familiar with database terminology, and that's what this chapter is about. Now, in this book, we use Microsoft SQL Server. That is something that you actually, when you went and did the install at the beginning, you've already got that on your system. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But as we start in here, all right, with XAMPP, we're not going to be using that. And don't worry if that doesn't make any sense to you. Please don't let that bother you one way or the other. All right, let's see. Still gathering information. All right, so we'll get an introduction to client-server systems, an intro to relational databases, and kind of an introduction to SQL as well. So, and that is, got my foot stuck. All right. It says, in case you aren't familiar with client-server systems, this topic introduces them to you. Then the rest of the chapter presents additional information on these components and on how you can use them in database apps. So, the three major components in the system here are the client, the server, and the network. Now, if you'd have looked at this picture a few years ago, every client would have looked like this. But due to the fact that today more people actually use tablets and phones that combined than use desktops and laptops, that's why they're showing all of them. And the network is basically just the internet. All right. So you're going to go make requests. Those requests are going to go to a database server, and you'll get the information back. Now, with what we're doing, we're sticking on the client side. So we're going to, for lack of better words, almost fool our computer in being able to use it as both a client and a server. Boy, I don't know why that's taking so long, but it is. All right. So the clients are the computers or mobile devices of the system. The server is a computer that stores files and databases of the system and provides client services. When it stores databases, it's typically a database server. And the network is basically the connection. All right. In a simple client server system, you probably have a LAN, which is a local area network, which means the stuff is either in the same room or in the same building. All right. LANs can be connected over private networks, which are typically referred to as WANs. And really, the internet is a big wide area network. It's a big WAN. When a system consists of a private network and servers over a wide area, it's typically called an enterprise system. All right. Now, the software components here, let's go through this. It says Figure 19.2 presents the software components of a typical client-server system. In addition to the NOS, or Network Operating System, the server requires a database management system. There's different kinds that you can use. You will be introduced to two in this chapter. One will be Microsoft SQL Server. One will be MySQL. All right. When you are in the AWD 1111 class that some of you will take next semester in fall and some of you will take next spring, all right, you are introduced into a special type, these are all what are called SQL or SQL or structured query language database management systems. But in that class, in the AWD 1111 class, you are introduced to what's called a NoSQL system called MongoDB. NoSQL doesn't mean there isn't any. NO means not only SQL. All right. Each client requires application software to do its thing. All right. This book, we will be using a combination of the database software and C#. All right. Now it says to make a connection between the client and the data possible for a C# app, the client accesses the database using a data access API, which is an application program interface, such as Entity Framework Core or ADO.NET. We will talk about both in this section. Once the software has been installed, the client communicates by passing queries back and forth to the DBMS through the API. If that makes no sense to you, it shouldn't really right now, but that's what we're going to be doing. All right. The processing done by a client-server system is divided between clients and server. If most of the work is done on the client, it's known as a fat client and a thin server. If most of the case is done on the server, it's known as a thin client and a fat server. So the client is going to basically be giving an SQL query to the database server, which will give the results back to the client. All right, and that's pretty much what they're saying in here. Now, this API application program interface, you will learn more about that, especially in the AWD 1111 class. You'll even learn how to build your own APIs in there. But basically, an API is a way to allow usually two pieces of software to talk to one another. I'm just going to keep it simple and say that. All right. So let's see. Before we go to this introduction, has this moved? No. I'm going to see if I can do this. I shouldn't probably, but I'm going to see if I can anyway. It's not taking that either. I don't know what the problem here is. So let me do a Control-Alt-Delete. Go to Task Manager. See what's going on in here. There's the uninstall. And I want to see if I can end that task. All right, let me end the task. I don't know if I still have loaded on my system if I still have XAMPP or not. So let me take a quick look, and it says it's still there. So it didn't remove it. So I'll just use the copy that I have, even though it's a little older. All right. Now, what's interesting about relational databases, which is what we're going to go over right now, is you'll notice that they really started 53 years ago. And when you think about how computers were 53 years ago, when basically what is about as powerful as what's on your phone was a computer that took up an entire humongous room. All right, what I'm getting to is computers have changed one heck of a lot in 50 years, but really, relational databases have not changed a lot in that amount of time. All right. What we're going to do is, and I'm going to give you just a couple, this is my take on this. So I'm going to go through this, but this is how I'm going to do it. All right. And that is this. When you think about a character, what's a character? All right. In fact, let's make it a keyboard character. All right. And basically, it's a character on your keyboard, right? All right. If I put one or more characters together, and usually there'll be a related characters, it equals what's called a field. So I could have a field, for example, called first name, where I could allow it to be maybe 25 characters. So anywhere from 1 to 25 characters. When I put one or more related fields together, I get what's called, okay, a record. When I put, so in other words, if I have 10 people in my class and I've got each person's first name, last name, address, city, state, zip, and I've got 10 of those, I've got 10 records. All right. If I've got one or more related records that I put together, that becomes then a table. It's a table full of information. You're going to see exactly what that looks like in just a moment. Finally, when I put one or more related records together, tables together, not records, tables together, I get what's called a database. Now, these are my definitions. All right. So a field is one or more related characters. A record is one or more related fields. A table is one or more related records. And a database is one or more related tables. Now, that's pretty much what they say on here. All right. Records, fields, etc. They've got a couple other things, so let's talk about these. Okay. How about a primary key? A primary key simply is a unique record identifier. Okay, so it's a way to uniquely identify people. Now, you're not supposed to be tracked online by anybody by your social security number, but plenty of places still do it. Okay? All right. If that primary key is more than one field, it's called a composite primary key. All right? You can also put constraints on a system. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then there's indexes. And people will say to me, I don't know what an index is. Of course you do. If I told you to grab your C# book and find the word index, what would you do? You'd probably go to the index at the back of the book. In fact, let's do that. All right, so I'm on page 610. Let's jump out to about page 800. Oh, okay, we can't go that far. So let's go as far as we can go. So let's go to 770. All right, and now let's back up a little bit. So if I told you to find indexes, there we are. So you'd go to the index and you'd look up index. Index, array database, and it says 610. So then we go back, and actually that's the page we're on. The reason I'm telling you that is basically that's kind of what an index in a database does too. It makes it easy, it makes it more efficient for you to be able to access the data that's in your database. Now, here's your first look at a table. This table has what? It has 4 fields in it. A field called product code, a field called description, a field called unit price, and a field called on-hand quantity. The first 3 fields are what we saw in our product class that we used earlier. So there's 4 fields. The first 2 fields, the product code and the description, those fields are each string fields, also known as varchar, and they got a lot of other names. Don't worry about it right now, but they're strings. The third field, unit price, is a decimal field. The fourth field, on-hand quantity, is called an int or an integer field. It's a whole number field. So there are 4 fields, and in addition, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 records. So 16 times 4 is 64. So there are 64 pieces of data in here. There are 16 primary keys. There are 4 fields or columns, and there are 16 rows or records. And that's pretty much what they're saying in here. So what happens, how are tables in the database related? Well, here's 2 tables. All right. And these are not the same table. The first table has invoice ID, customer ID, invoice data, product total, sales tax, shipping, and invoice total. The second table has invoice ID, product code, unit price, quantity, and item total. But you'll notice there is a field in common between these two. Invoice ID is here one time. This is the primary key. We also added the invoice ID in here. It is not a primary key in here. It is what is referred to as a foreign key. All right? We added this field from this table so we were able to combine information together. So if somebody says they want the customer ID, the product total, and the item total, let's say, we can combine information from those 2 tables. All right? And that's what they're saying in here. All right? There is a one-to-many relationship between these tables. All right? This is an invoice table. This is an invoice line item table. Each invoice contains 0, 1, or more line items. It is a one-to-many relationship. You typically work with 3 different relationships in a database system. One-to-one, we'll talk about that at a later time. Many-to-many, we'll talk about that at a later time. And what you see here, which is one-to-many. All right? So when you define the data that goes into these columns, you'll be doing something like this. You'll give the column a name. You'll give it a data type. You'll notice here, if it's a primary key, if we click over here, you're going to learn how to do all this, so please don't worry about it. But it'll put a little key there. All right? Int means it's a whole number. Date time is just that. And money means it'll hold money. Allow nulls. Notice none of these are checked. If any are checked, that means you can leave the field blank. If we had defaults, maybe we want the default to be the current date. We could put that in there. All right? So these are some of the data types, and again, don't worry about them. But the data type that you assign to the field, as it says in the description, determines the type of information that can be stored in that field. I already told you what nulls were. I told you what defaults were. All right. There's also such a thing as an identity column. And for instance, this one very well might be an identity column here. So this is going to be the primary key, and it'll start at 1 for the first record. The second record, it'll automatically up it to 2. So if there's 100 records, there'll be 1 through 100. All right. Now, the database that they're going to use in here, and we will take a look at it, it's called the MMA. I'm not sure what MMA stands for. It probably has something. Maybe it even shows it in here. But it's a Murachs something or other database. Okay? As it says, it'll be used in the programming examples throughout the section. Although the database may seem complicated, it's really not too bad. When we look at it, this is the makeup of that database. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different tables in it. We've got a customers table. We have an invoices table. We have a states table. We have an invoice line items table. We have a products table. And we have an order options table. All right. All out of these 6 tables, 5 of them are linked to one another. 5 of them are linked to one another. The order options table is the only one that's not linked directly or indirectly to the other tables. All right, you can read that in here as well. All right, so how to use SQL to work with a relational database. What I've decided, and I'm literally doing this all on the fly. I've been doing this whole thing on the fly. Whoops. And that is, I don't know ever how to go, if I'm going too far, etc. in here. All right. So we are getting into the SQL part. This goes up to 625. We're here already. All right. What you do when you use SQL is you do what are called CRUD operations. CRUD is an acronym that stands for create, read, update, and delete. And you'll notice it says we're going to learn about 4 statements. The first one is select, which is like read, which means show me something. Insert, which is like create, which means let me add something. Update, which says let me modify something. And delete, which says let me remove something. All right. When we ask for information, this is what we're going to be using. It may look a little hard, but believe me, and once we go through and spend a day or so on examples, not only do most people say it's not hard, they actually say they really like it because it makes a lot of sense. So we will select one or more columns from one or more tables. And if we want to, we can put in some criteria with a where statement. And if we want to, we can order it in ascending or descending order. So this says go to the customers table. And in that customers table, give me the name of each customer and the city they're from, but only if their state is Washington. And then order it by name. So these are all in here, cities that are in Washington. Okay? Now, sometimes we talked about this before. You have to combine information together from more than one table. I'm going to actually show you 2 ways of doing this when we get to this point. The way that the author shows it here is the recommended way. It's the, quote, new way of doing things. I'm going to show you the way I was taught, which was the, quote, old way of doing things. It works just as well. You can use either one. All right. So what we will be doing is a lot of inserting information into a database. That means adding a new record, updating information in a database, which means modifying one or more existing records, deleting stuff in a database, which means deleting one or more records, or selecting information from a database, which means show me one or more records or one or more pieces of information. Now that's it. And I went through that quickly. I only spent 25 or so minutes on this. We will have, once we get into it in class, we will have at least one period, at least 4 hours, where we're going to bring up that database and we will write upwards of 100 queries against that database so you can see how all this stuff comes together. All right, I don't want this to throw you or anything else. Now I'm done for today. I've done several of these lectures today. Tomorrow I'm going to pick it up and I'm going to hopefully do chapters 20, 21, and 22. Chapter 20 is a long chapter. How to use Entity Framework Core. And you'll notice it's 50 pages long. That's okay. I will be doing that tomorrow morning, and for as long as it takes me. Then I will jump into chapter 21, which is how to use ADO. ADO is an acronym. So is EF for Entity Framework, but ADO is ActiveX Data Objects to write your own data access code. And that's not as long. That's about 40 pages. All right. And then when we get done with that, we'll go through the last chapter of the book, if I can get there, which is on how to use the data grid view control, which you'll probably like because what it does is it shows the data and it looks like on a spreadsheet like this. All right, so when I come back tomorrow, I'm going to start immediately with, oops, I guess it's a little further than that. I am going to start on chapter 20 of 22. So we'll pick it up there tomorrow. I'll talk to you then.